She didn't want the house. That's the part nobody tells you first. When the lawyer called Carol Jennings on a Tuesday morning in late October and told her that her grandmother had left her the old property on the edge of Clover Hill, Virginia, Carol didn't feel grateful. She felt the cold, quiet weight of a burden she never asked to carry. Her grandmother, Ruth Eleanor Jennings, had been gone for 3 weeks by then, and the grief was still so fresh and so sharp that Carol could barely get through a phone call without her voice cracking at the edges. She was 41 years old, recently divorced, raising 2 kids on a teacher's salary, and the last thing on her mind was an old house that smelled like cedar and old rain. But that house, that creaking, whispering, century-old house, was about to change Carol Jennings' life in a way that no one, not Carol herself, not the lawyers, not the neighbors on Clover Hill Road, could ever have imagined. Because when Carol finally pushed open that front door and stepped inside for the first time as its legal owner, she had absolutely no idea that somewhere beneath her feet, hidden behind walls that had stood for over 140 years, something was waiting. Something that had been waiting for a very, very long time. Before we go any further into this story, we want to hear from you. Go ahead and drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you are watching from right now. We genuinely love hearing from our community, and it means more than you know. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let us go back to where this story truly begins. Carol Jennings grew up knowing 2 things about her grandmother Ruth. The first was that Ruth Eleanor Jennings was the kind of woman who never wasted a single word. She spoke plainly, directly, and only when she had something worth saying. The second was that Ruth had a relationship with that old house on Clover Hill Road that went far beyond ordinary attachment. Ruth had lived in that house for 63 years. She had raised 4 children inside its walls, buried a husband, survived a flood that took out the back porch, and refused no fewer than 6 separate offers from real estate developers who wanted to tear the whole thing down and build condominiums. Ruth used to say, and Carol remembered this clearly, that the house had earned its right to stand. She never quite explained what she meant by that. Carol had always assumed it was just the sentimental language of an old woman who loved her home. She would later understand that Ruth had meant every single syllable. The house itself was built sometime around 1871, according to the county deed records that Carol would eventually spend weeks combing through. It was a large, 2-story colonial-style home with whitewood siding that had gone the color of old cream, black shutters that hung slightly off-angle on the upper windows, and a wide front porch with a wooden swing that Ruth had never once taken down even through the harshest winters. The property sat on just over 2 acres of land that backed up against a tree line of old Virginia oak and hickory, and the nearest neighbor was a 1/4 mile down the road. It was the kind of house that looked, at a distance, like a painting. Something deliberately composed, deliberately still. The kind of house that made you feel, even from the road, that it was watching you just as much as you were watching it. Carol had spent dozens of Christmases and summer vacations inside those walls as a child. She knew every squeaky floorboard, every drafty hallway, every cabinet door that would not stay closed. Or at least she thought she did. Carol drove down to Clover Hill the first weekend of November, 2 weeks after the lawyer's call, with her 2 children, her 14-year-old son Marcus and her 11-year-old daughter Deja, tucked into the back seat of her Subaru with their headphones in and their eyes on their phones. It was a 4-hour drive from Baltimore, and Carol spent most of it in the particular silence of a person who is trying very hard not to think about the thing they are actually thinking about. She was thinking about Ruth. About the last real conversation they had, 6 months before Ruth passed, when Carol had driven down for a Sunday dinner, and the 2 of them had sat on that front porch long after the food was cleared, watching the last light drain out of the Virginia sky. Ruth had said something that evening that Carol kept turning over in her mind like a stone she couldn't quite see the underside of. Ruth had reached over, placed her hand on top of Carol's, and said, quietly and without any particular emotion, "When the time comes, don't be in a rush to sell it. Walk through it first, all the way through." Carol had nodded, assuming it was general advice from a woman who knew her time was running short. She had not asked what Ruth meant by all the way through. She wished, now that she had. They arrived at the house in the early afternoon, the November sky flat and gray overhead, the long gravel driveway crunching beneath the tires as Carol pulled in and stopped. Marcus pulled one headphone off and looked out the window at the old house and said, simply, "It's big." Deja said nothing for a moment and then asked whether there was Wi-Fi. Carol laughed despite herself, that particular tired laugh of single mothers everywhere, and got out of the car. Standing in the driveway, looking up at the house, she felt something she hadn't expected. She felt the house. That was the only way she would later describe it, and she would struggle to describe it better than that every time she tried. She felt it the way you sometimes feel a room before you enter it, a pressure or a presence, or a simple, undeniable weight of accumulated years. She shook it off, grabbed the house keys from her coat pocket, and walked up the porch steps for the first time as its owner. The inside smelled exactly as she remembered. Cedar, yes, and something beneath that. Old paper, old wood, the particular dusty sweetness of a house that has been lived in and loved for generations. Ruth's furniture was still in place. The estate lawyer had told Carol she could take her time deciding what to do with the contents, and so everything remained exactly as Ruth had left it. The tall oak bookshelf in the hallway, the faded blue and cream rug in the front sitting room, the collection of ceramic roosters on the kitchen windowsill that Carol had made fun of affectionately her entire childhood. Walking through those rooms was like walking through a preserved version of something she loved and had lost, and the grief came at her in waves as she moved from room to room, touching the backs of chairs, running her fingers along the kitchen counter, standing for a long moment at the foot of the stairs. Marcus and Deja had dispersed through the house immediately, their footsteps echoing above her on the second floor, their voices carrying down through the old ceilings and fragments. Carol stood alone in the kitchen and allowed herself to cry for the first time since the funeral. She spent that first weekend doing nothing more than being in the house, sleeping in her old childhood guest room, eating takeout from the diner in town, letting the kids run around the property and burn off the particular restlessness of children cooped up in a car too long. She did not yet think about selling it or renovating it or what she was going to do with 2 acres and a colonial house in rural Virginia when she had a life and a job 4 hours north in Baltimore. Those questions were real, but they were not yet urgent, and for that first weekend Carol was content to simply let the house be the house and let herself be a granddaughter who had lost someone she loved. It was Deja who found the door first. This is the part of this story that Carol has told many times in the years since, and the part that she says still gives her the particular chill that you get when the world shifts slightly beneath you and something that was hidden becomes visible. It was the second afternoon of their visit, a Sunday, and Deja had been exploring the house with the thoroughness that 11-year-olds bring to old buildings, opening every closet, peeking into every corner, pressing on every panel that looked slightly different from the panels around it. Carol had been in the sitting room going through a box of Ruth's papers when Deja appeared in the doorway with an expression on her face that was caught exactly halfway between excited and uncertain. "Mom," Deja said, "there's a door in the wall of Grandma Ruth's sewing room, and I don't think it goes to a closet." Carol looked up from the papers. "What do you mean?" "I mean, it doesn't look like a closet door. It's different. It's low and it's behind the big cabinet, and I think the cabinet is on wheels or something because it moved when I pulled it." Carol set the papers down and followed her daughter upstairs. Ruth's sewing room was at the end of the second-floor hallway, a small, bright room with 2 windows that faced the back property and the tree line, where Ruth had kept her sewing machine, her fabric boxes, and a large, dark-stained oak cabinet that Carol had always assumed was a wardrobe. It stood against the interior wall, tall and heavy and perfectly ordinary-looking. But Deja was right. There were small rubber wheels on the bottom of the cabinet, barely visible, nearly hidden beneath the cabinet's base, and when Carol gripped the edge of the cabinet and pulled, it swung outward from the wall with a smoothness that was startling for something that looked so immovable. Behind it was a door, low and narrow, perhaps 5 feet tall and barely 2 feet wide, set directly into the interior wall with no trim around it, no visible hinges on the outside. The door was made of old planked wood, darker than the wall around it, and at its center, roughly at chest height for an adult, was a small iron latch. No lock, just a latch. Carol stood in front of that door for a long moment while Deja stood beside her and Marcus appeared behind them both, having heard the commotion from wherever he'd been in the house. All 3 of them stood there in the doorway of Ruth's sewing room, looking at a door that none of them had ever seen before, in a house that Carol had visited her entire life. "Did you know that was there?" Marcus asked. "No," Carol said, and she meant it completely. She lifted the latch. The door swung inward, into darkness, and the air that came out of it was cold and still and old in a way that was different from the rest of the house. Heavier, denser, like air that had been sitting undisturbed for a very long time. Carol reached into the darkness and found, surprisingly, a light switch mounted on the interior wall just inside the door frame. She pushed it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a single bare bulb, mounted somewhere below and ahead of her, flickered to life, and Carol saw a narrow set of wooden stairs descending into the wall of the house. She would later discover, after weeks of research and conversations with historians and a structural engineer, that what she was looking at was not unusual for houses of this age and type in this part of Virginia. Many colonial-era homes built in the mid to late 1800s had interior passages and rooms that were not documented on any official floor plan. Some were simple storage spaces. Some were servants' quarters that were later sealed off. And some, a notable and historically significant number of some, were rooms built deliberately and secretly for a very specific purpose. But Carol did not know any of that yet. What Carol knew, standing at the top of that narrow staircase with her 2 children behind her and the cold, old air rising up from below, was that her grandmother had known this door was here. That her grandmother had placed that large oak cabinet in front of it, on wheels, so that it could be moved but would appear stationary to anyone who didn't know to look. And that her grandmother, in 63 years of living in this house and decades of family visits and Christmases and Sunday dinners, had never once mentioned it. Carol went down the stairs. The staircase was 10 steps, steep and narrow, with a wooden railing on one side that had been worn smooth by what must have been decades of hands gripping it on the way down. At the bottom, the bare bulb cast a yellow light over a room that made Carol stop breathing for a moment. It was not a large room, perhaps 15 feet long and 7 feet wide, with ceiling height that would have allowed a tall adult to stand with an inch or 2 to spare. The walls were raw field stone, thick, irregular stones set in old lime mortar, and the floor was packed earth, hard and smooth as old concrete. There was no window. There was no other door. There was, pushed against the far wall, a low wooden platform that had clearly once served as a sleeping shelf, its surface worn smooth and dark. And there were things on that platform that Carol would spend the next several months trying to understand. There was a small tin cup. There was a torn piece of heavy fabric, thick, coarse cotton, off-white, the kind of material that Carol, standing in that room, would immediately recognize as belonging to a different century entirely. There was a child's wooden button. There were marks on the stone wall beside the sleeping shelf, small, careful lines scratched into the mortar between the stones, in groups of 4 vertical lines and 1 diagonal, the universal notation of a person counting days. Carol stood in the cold of that room and looked at those counting marks on the wall and felt something move through her that was beyond language. She counted the marks. She stood in that small underground room and counted the marks scratched into the wall by a hand that had been there before her, and she counted 43 days. Someone had been in this room for 43 days. Carol brought no one else down into that room that evening. She told Marcus and Deja to wait upstairs, and after she came back up, she latched the door and moved the cabinet carefully back into place and sat down at Ruth's kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the particular stillness of a person who has just encountered something too large to process quickly. She was a high school history teacher. She taught American history. She sat at her grandmother's kitchen table and she thought about what she had just seen. The fieldstone walls, the earthen floor, the sleeping shelf, the tin cup, the coarse cotton fabric, the 43 counting marks scratched into old mortar by someone who had been there for 43 days. And she arrived, quietly and with complete certainty, at the same conclusion that any American history teacher would have arrived at. She thought about the Underground Railroad. Before we go any further in Carol's story, we want to take a moment to give you a fuller picture of what the Underground Railroad actually was, because this history is essential to understanding everything that happens next. The Underground Railroad was not a railroad, and it was not underground. It was a network, vast, secretive, extraordinarily dangerous, of people, routes, and safe houses that stretched across the eastern and central United States from roughly the 1780s through the Civil War used by enslaved Black Americans to escape slavery in the South and reach freedom in the North and in Canada. At its peak in the decades just before the Civil War, it is estimated to have helped more than 100,000 people reach freedom, though historians note that the true number is likely impossible to know because, by its very nature, the network left as few records as possible. The people who operated the safe houses, the so-called stations on the railroad, were taking enormous legal risks. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made it a federal crime to assist an escaped enslaved person, punishable by imprisonment and heavy fines, and it required even citizens of free northern states to participate in the capture and return of freedom seekers. The people who defied that law did so knowing exactly what they were risking. The houses used as stations on the Underground Railroad were carefully designed to conceal their purpose. Trapdoors and floorboards, attics with false partitions, root cellars with hidden side chambers, rooms behind movable furniture. The construction had to be invisible to anyone who might come searching, and it had to be capable of concealing multiple people, often families, often including small children, for days or even weeks at a time while they waited for conditions to be safe enough to move again. 14 feet beneath the basement of a Pennsylvania home, historians have documented a room used for this exact purpose. Behind the weighted bottom drawer of a dresser built into the wall of a Manhattan row house, a 2-foot square trapdoor was discovered that led to a passage used by freedom seekers escaping north through New York City. These rooms, these passages, these hiding places, they exist all across the eastern United States, and the majority of them have never been formally documented. They are in attics and basements and behind walls and houses that their current owners pass through every day, completely unaware of the history compressed into the space behind the plaster or beneath the floorboards. The house at Clover Hill Road in Virginia had been built, according to the deed records Carol would eventually locate, in 1871, 6 years after the end of the Civil War. But Carol, as a history teacher, knew that 1871 was not the beginning of any story. It was, in many ways, the aftermath. The Reconstruction era in Virginia was a time of extraordinary political and social volatility, when formerly enslaved people were navigating new legal freedom in a state that was in many ways deeply resistant to what that freedom meant. The violence of the Reconstruction period was real and documented, and the need for safe, secret spaces did not end cleanly with the signing of the 13th Amendment. Carol sat at Ruth's kitchen table and turned this history over in her mind, piece by piece, and the room in the wall felt less and less like an anomaly and more like a document. A physical document, written in stone and earth and the scratched counting of days. Dr. Patricia Wells came down to Clover Hill on the second weekend in November. She was a compact, energetic woman in her early 60s, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular manner of an academic who has spent so long working with primary sources that she approaches every new space as if it might be the source. She descended the stairs behind the cabinet in Ruth's sewing room with a headlamp and a pair of latex gloves, and she spent nearly 2 hours in that room before she came back up. When she did, she sat down across from Carol at the kitchen table, took off the headlamp, and was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they are choosing their words carefully because the words matter. The construction is consistent, Dr. Wells said. The fieldstone work, the mortar composition, the ceiling height, the sleeping platform, all of it is consistent with what we see in documented stations from this region in the mid to late 19th century. She paused. The counting marks are what interest me most. They're not decorative. They're not absent-minded scratching. They are deliberate. Someone was tracking time in that room with real intention. She paused again. They wanted to remember how long they were there. Or they wanted someone else to remember. Carol asked the question she'd been holding since the moment she first counted those marks. 43 days. What does 43 days mean for someone hiding in a room like this? Dr. Wells looked at her. It means they were waiting for something that took a very long time to come, she said. It means the conditions outside were dangerous enough that whoever was sheltering them felt it was safer to keep them there than to move them. It means that for 43 days, someone slept on that platform and ate whatever food was brought to them, and heard the house above them, and did not know with certainty whether they were going to survive. The room was quiet for a long moment. And then, Carol asked, and then, Dr. Wells said, presumably, they were moved. Or they were not. She looked at Carol steadily. We don't always know the endings. This was the part of the research that Carol found hardest to sit with. Not the mystery of who had been in the room, but the real and documented possibility that for some of the people who had passed through rooms like this one, the story did not have a resolution that history could trace. The Underground Railroad was a network built on secrecy, which meant that the paper trail was sparse by design. Conductors and station operators rarely wrote things down. When they did, they used code. The names of freedom seekers were almost never recorded, because a recorded name was a liability, evidence that could condemn both the hidden and the hider. The history of the railroad exists in fragments, in the memories of survivors who spoke decades later, in the sparse records of abolitionist societies, in the occasional letter or diary entry that slipped through the deliberate destruction of evidence, and increasingly, in the physical spaces themselves, in rooms like the one beneath Ruth Jennings' sewing room, where the evidence is written in stone and earth and the marks of counted days. Dr. Wells connected Carol with two other historians over the following weeks, and the three of them began the careful work of examining the room and the house and the documentary record that Carol was assembling from the county clerk's archives. What emerged, slowly and painstakingly, was a picture of the property's history that went back well before Ruth, well before the mid-20th century when the Jennings family had come to own it, well before the generation of owners that Carol could find in the public record. The 1871 deed recorded the original builder of the house as a man named Thomas Aldwell, a free black farmer and craftsman who had purchased the 2-acre property and built the house himself, employing two other men whose names were listed in a contemporaneous account in the Clover Hill Gazette as skilled carpenters from the local community. Thomas Aldwell. Carol wrote the name at the top of a fresh page in her legal pad and drew a line beneath it and began pulling on every thread she could find. Thomas Aldwell, it turned out, was not difficult to find in the historical record, not because he had been famous or powerful or because history had chosen to preserve his story with any particular care, but because he had been, in his time, a man of standing in the free black community of the Clover Hill region, and his name appeared in church records and land transaction documents, and in the minutes of a local community association that had been active in the 1870s and 1880s. He had been born free, in Virginia, in 1838, which meant that he had spent the first 27 years of his life as a free black man in a slave state. A legal status that was real but precarious, surrounded on all sides by the institution of slavery and all the violence and surveillance that sustained it. He had married a woman named Bessie in 1862, during the Civil War, and they had had 4 children. He had built his house in 1871, the year Virginia was formally readmitted to the Union under Reconstruction, and he had lived in it until his death in 1909. Bessie had survived him by 12 years, dying in 1921. After that, the property had changed hands several times over the following decades in ways that Carol was still tracing when she found the letter in Ruth's Bible in December. The letter was old. That was the first thing Carol noticed when she unfolded it, carefully, at the kitchen table with the overhead light on and both hands steady with the kind of deliberate steadiness you impose on yourself when you're handling something fragile. The paper was the color of old tea, soft at the folds in a way that suggested it had been opened and refolded many times over many years. The ink was faded to a pale brown, but the handwriting was clear, small, careful, upright, the penmanship of someone who had been taught to write with discipline and took it seriously. There was no date at the top. There was no salutation. It began simply, mid-thought, as if it were the continuation of a conversation already in progress. The letter read, and Carol would later read it aloud to Dr. Wells and the other historians word for word, as follows. You will find this when I am gone, or perhaps before, if you are reading carefully the way I always told you to read. The room behind the cabinet is real, and it is old, and it must not be forgotten. My grandfather Thomas built this house with his own hands, and he built that room with his own hands also, and he built it to finish what he had begun before the war, when there was no house yet, but there was already need. He had people there. He had families there. He kept them safe until it was time to move them north, and he never wrote down their names because their names were their own and not his to record. He told my grandmother Bessie that one family stayed 43 days because the roads were watched, and the only way north was closed until January brought the snow deep enough to cover the tracks. He said the mother counted every day on the wall so her children would know they had survived each one. When it was safe to go, Thomas walked them to the next station himself, 2 miles through the trees in the dark. He never saw them again. He did not know their names. He knew they were free. I am telling you this because it must not be buried with me. This house has earned its right to stand. Carol set the letter down. She sat with her hands flat on the table on either side of it, and she read the last line again. This house has earned its right to stand. Ruth Eleanor Jennings, who had refused 6 real estate developers and lived in that house for 63 years and placed a cabinet on wheels in front of a door that led to American history, had been keeping this letter, had been keeping it in her Bible, close to her bed, for however many years she had known about it. And at the end of her life, on a Sunday evening on the front porch with the Virginia light going out, she had told her granddaughter to walk through it all the way through. This was what all the way through meant. Carol called Dr. Wells that evening. She read the letter aloud over the phone, slowly, all the way through. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Dr. Wells said, quietly, "Carol, do you understand what you have?" And Carol said, "I'm starting to." What Carol had, it would become clear over the following months, was extraordinary. She had a physically intact room, a letter that provided direct family testimony connecting the room to the Underground Railroad, a named builder, Thomas Aldwell, whose history could be researched and documented, and a property with a chain of custody that could be traced. This was not common. In fact, when Dr. Wells convened a small group of historians and a representative from the Virginia Historic Preservation Office to assess the Clover Hill property in January, the representative, a careful, methodical man named Warren Hobbs, who had spent 15 years reviewing historical designations, described what Carol had as one of the most intact and documentable examples of an Underground Railroad station in the Commonwealth of Virginia. He said this quietly and without performance, in the way that people in his profession describe significant things, because people in his profession have learned to be careful about superlatives. But the word he used was intact, and the word he used was documentable. And Carol, standing in the sewing room with her arms folded against the January cold while Warren Hobbs spoke, thought about her grandmother Ruth living in this house for 63 years, maintaining it, refusing to sell it, keeping the letter, keeping the secret, and keeping it safe. And Carol understood that the intactness of this place was not accidental. It was Ruth's life's work. And before we go any further, we want to pause and say this directly. We want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? Drop it in the comments, your city, your country, wherever you are. We read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This community means everything, and stories like this one deserve to be heard. The formal research process that followed was slow and meticulous and deeply unglamorous in the way that real history work always is. Carol worked with the historians every weekend, and on weekdays she spent her evenings at her kitchen table in Baltimore going through scanned documents that the county clerk's office had agreed to provide access to, tracing the property record forward and backward in time, tracking Thomas Aldwell through every mention she could find in the archival record, and attempting to do something that she knew from the beginning might not be possible. Find the names of the people who had been in that room. She did not expect to succeed. Dr. Wells had prepared her for the likelihood, even the probability, that those names were simply gone, deliberately erased by the people who had sheltered them, lost to the passage of time, impossible to recover. That was the nature of this history. The people who needed the most protection were the people whose names were most carefully kept out of the record. Carol understood this intellectually, and she accepted it. But she kept looking anyway, because some things you look for even when you don't expect to find them. She found a thread in March, for months after she'd first opened the door behind the cabinet. It came not from a Virginia archive, but from a collection of abolitionist correspondence held at a university in Philadelphia, a collection that Dr. Wells had remembered existed and had arranged for Carol to access digitally. The collection contained letters sent between members of a Philadelphia-based anti-slavery network in the 1860s and 1870s, and one of those letters, dated January 1873, referenced a family, described only as a mother and 3 children, including an infant, who had been safely conducted from the Virginia station to Philadelphia after what the letter described as a prolonged winter sojourn due to heavily monitored roads. The letter noted, with evident relief, that the family had arrived in good health despite the extended wait, and that they had been assisted in their final passage by the man Aldwell, who accompanied them through the winter wood at considerable personal risk. The man Aldwell. Thomas Aldwell. January 1873. Carol sat at her kitchen table in Baltimore at 11 o'clock at night and stared at a scanned letter written 150 years ago and felt the room expand around her in the way that rooms do when something large and true enters them. A mother and 3 children, including an infant. A prolonged winter sojourn. 43 days counted on a stone wall by a mother who wanted her children to know they had survived each one. January 1873, and Thomas Aldwell walking them through the winter wood in the dark, 2 miles to the next station, and then watching them go north without knowing their names. She called her daughter Deja into the kitchen. Deja, who was 11 and had been the one to find the door, who had pulled the cabinet on its hidden wheels and shown her mother the low, narrow door in the wall of the sewing room. Carol sat Deja down at the kitchen table and told her what she had found and what it meant, in the careful, plain language that a history teacher uses with someone who is young enough that the language needs to be clear but old enough to understand why it matters. She told her about Thomas Aldwell building the room with his own hands. She told her about the mother counting the days on the wall. She told her about the letter in the Philadelphia archive. Deja listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and when Carol finished, Deja was quiet for a moment and then said, "The marks on the wall. Those were her marks. The mom's marks." "Yes," Carol said. Deja thought about this. "She did it for her kids," she said, "so they would know they made it through each day." "That's what I think," Carol said. Deja nodded slowly, taking this in. "We should keep the house," she said. This was, as it happened, exactly the conclusion that Carol had already reached. The question of what to do with the Clover Hill property had shifted entirely in Carol's mind from a logistical problem. How do you maintain a house 4 hours away on a teacher's salary, to something that felt, by this point, less like a choice and more like a responsibility? Ruth had kept this house and kept this secret and kept this room intact for 63 years. Thomas Aldwell had built the room. A mother and her children had been safe inside it. The history was real, and it was documented, and it was sitting in a house that someone needed to tend. Carol began talking to the Virginia Historic Preservation Office about a formal historical designation for the property. This process, she quickly learned, was not fast. It involved written applications, supporting documentation, site assessments, review periods, and a chain of bureaucratic steps that tested the patience of even the most committed applicants. Warren Hobbs, the Preservation Office representative who had visited in January, became something of an informal guide through the process, answering Carol's questions over email with the methodical helpfulness of a person who genuinely cared about the outcome. He told her that if the designation went through, the property could eventually be eligible for preservation grants and potentially for inclusion in a documented network of underground railroad sites in the state. He told her that there were very few properties in Virginia with the combination of physical evidence and documentary evidence that Carol had assembled. He told her to be patient. Carol was patient. She was also, in the meantime, doing something that no official process required her to do. She was writing it down. All of it. Thomas Aldwell and Bessie and the 4 children. The house built in 1871. The room behind the cabinet. The tin cup and the wooden button and the 43 counting marks. The letter in Ruth's Bible. The Philadelphia archive and the January 1873 letter and the mother and 3 children, including an infant, safely conducted after the prolonged winter sojourn. She was writing it down in the way that a history teacher writes things down. Carefully, with citations, with the awareness that the integrity of the record matters because the record is all that remains of lives that the official record had worked so hard to erase. She wrote it because Dr. Wells had said someone must, and because Ruth had said it must not be buried with her, and because a mother in 1873 had scratched 43 marks into a stone wall so that her children would know they had survived each one, and Carol understood that surviving and being remembered are not the same thing, and that the work of remembering is its own kind of obligation. By the spring of that year, word had begun to spread in the local community around Clover Hill. Carol had not made any public announcement, but the nature of small communities in rural Virginia being what it was, The presence of historians and a preservation office representative at the house on weekends had generated the kind of low-level awareness that didn't need a press release to travel. The woman who ran the local diner stopped Carol one Saturday morning as she was getting coffee and said, with characteristic directness, "I heard about what you found up there at the Jennings place. You planning to keep it?" Carol said she was. The woman nodded, set a second coffee cup on the counter, and said, "Ruth would be glad." There were people in the Clover Hill community who remembered Ruth, and some of them, it turned out, had pieces of the story that Carol didn't have. An elderly man named Albert, who had been a neighbor of Ruth's for 30 years, remembered Ruth telling him once, when he'd asked about the big cabinet in the sewing room, that some things were best left undisturbed until the right person came along to disturb them. He had not known what she meant. He told Carol this story, standing in the driveway of the Clover Hill house one April afternoon, and he said it with the particular satisfaction of a person for whom a long-standing puzzle has finally resolved. "She was waiting for you," he said. Carol told him she wasn't sure about that. Albert shrugged. She was particular about who she talked to and what she told them. She kept that secret her whole life. "She didn't tell me, and I was her neighbor for 30 years. She told you to walk through it. That's particular." Carol thought about this. She thought about Ruth sitting on the porch in the last Virginia light, saying, "Don't be in a rush." She thought about the cabinet on wheels, placed there by someone, Ruth or a previous owner, with enough care and enough foresight to make the door invisible while keeping it accessible. She thought about the letter in the Bible, kept close to the bed, read enough times that the folds had gone soft. Ruth had not discovered the room, Carol came to believe. Ruth had known about it from early in her 63 years in that house, possibly from the very beginning, possibly because whoever sold her the house had told her. The letter had been written for Ruth or for whoever came before her, and it had been received by the right person and kept faithfully, and now it had been passed to Carol. The formal historical designation process concluded in the fall of that year with the Clover Hill property being listed on the Virginia Landmarks Register, a designation that recognized its historical significance and made it eligible for the various preservation programs that Warren Hobbs had described. The citation in the designation paperwork identified the property as a documented station of the Underground Railroad, associated with Thomas Aldwell, free black craftsman, and noted the intact underground room and the associated documentary evidence. It was careful, official language, the language of institutional history, and Carol was glad of it. But the thing that mattered most to her was not the designation. It was the room itself, which she had done nothing to alter or renovate. The sleeping platform was still there. The tin cup was still on it. The wooden button was still there. And on the far wall, beside the platform, in the cold, still air of a room that had been waiting for 150 years, the 43 marks were still scratched into the mortar between the stones. A mother's counting. A record of survival. An act of love so quiet and so durable that it had outlasted everything except the stone it was written on. Carol Jennings moved to Clover Hill the following summer. This surprised people, including Carol herself. It meant leaving Baltimore, finding a new teaching position, pulling Marcus and Deja out of their schools and into new ones, managing all the considerable disruption that a major life move entails. It was not the practical choice. Carol had never been particularly interested in practical choices where they conflicted with the ones that felt true, and this felt completely true. She had grown up visiting that house, and she had spent 2 years learning its deepest story, and she had come to understand, in the way you understand things that arrive through the accumulation of evidence rather than through any single revelation, that the house needed her in a way that was not metaphorical. It needed someone who knew what it was and who would tend it and keep the record and let the room remain as it was. She is still there. Carol Jennings lives in the house on Clover Hill Road in Virginia that her grandmother Ruth left her, in the house that Thomas Aldwell built in 1871 with his own hands, and with a room in the wall that he built to finish what he had begun before the war. She teaches American history at the county high school, and once a year she brings her students to the house, carefully, in small groups, with permission slips and preparation and the kind of pedagogy that treats primary sources with the seriousness they deserve. She takes them down the stairs behind the cabinet. She shows them the room. She shows them the tin cup and the wooden button and the sleeping platform worn smooth. She shows them the marks on the wall, 43 of them, in groups of 4 and 1, scratched into the mortar by a mother who wanted her children to know they had survived each day. She lets the students stand in the cold, still air of the room for as long as they need to. She answers their questions. She tells them the story. She tells them about Thomas Aldwell. She tells them about the mother and the 3 children and the 43 days and the January snow deep enough to cover the tracks and the 2-mile walk through the winter wood in the dark. She tells them about the letter in the Bible and what Ruth kept and why, and what she said on the porch in the last light. She tells them about Deja finding the door and the cabinet on wheels and the cold air that rose up from the darkness when the latch was lifted for the first time in however many years. She tells all of it, because this is what history teachers do. They carry the record and they pass it on, and they trust that the next person and the person after that and the person after that will carry it forward into whatever comes next. Outside, the Virginia oaks stand over the property the way they have always stood. The house is the color of old cream. The porch swing is there, the one Ruth never took down even in the worst winters. The gravel driveway crunches under tires when visitors come. And inside, behind the oak cabinet in the sewing room at the end of the second-floor hallway, the door in the wall waits with its iron latch, the same as it has always been, and the room below is still and cold and full of history that is not gone but preserved, not erased but written in stone, not silent but waiting, as it has always been waiting, for someone who will come down the stairs and stand in the dark and be still enough and honest enough to listen. Ruth Eleanor Jennings knew this house had earned its right to stand. Now, so does Carol. And now, so do you.